Thank you. It's a pleasure to speak to you today. I'm going to be talking very briefly about strategies for driving and supporting change in engineering education, in engineering schools and universities. Just to give you a brief background, over the past 10 or 15 years there's been significant international debate as to why engineering education needs to change. And there's also been a large degree of consensus on what needs to change, what educational approaches, interventions, classroom experiences help students to develop these kind of knowledge, skills and attitudes that we're looking for. But I think the question of how to make it happen is often not addressed and is very problematic. And that will be the focus of my discussion, and it's certainly the focus of much of my consultancy work, both in research and in supporting universities. And I'm just going to highlight a few findings from some of the recent studies that I've done looking at educational change in engineering. One of those studies was published in 2012 with the Royal Academy of Engineering at MIT. And I looked at programs of systemic change in engineering education that have occurred over the past 20 years across the world. And as part of this study, I interviewed almost 200 individuals from 15 countries. And I looked at successful change and unsuccessful change. And one of the things that was very striking was that if I looked at the group of changes that were successful and sustained, there were a huge degree of common features between those. Commonality between the strategies taken, the approach, the context under which the change occurred, when you compared it to the failed changes. And very briefly, I just wanted to highlight some of the findings from that study and some of the conditions and strategies associated with successful change in engineering education. The first was that the successful and sustainable changes were embedded into a redesigned, coherent and interconnected curriculum. So, for example, the engineering school didn't say, hey, let's create some problem-based courses and have them in parallel to our existing curriculum. That tended to work for a while, but actually it was often highly reliant on a small number of individuals, and ultimately 5, 6, 7 years down the line it invariably led to failure. The successful changes took a coherent and interconnected approach with a new and old curriculum together with multiple interdependencies. Another strategy very often associated with success is that a cross-section of faculty were engaged with change. It's not just about motivating and mobilising the enthusiasts, but actually engaging a wider cross-section of the faculty from across the school. The endeavour is supported by the department head. I know I'm speaking here to engineering deans, who are obviously an important part of change, but one of the things that was very striking was the importance of a trusted, respected and highly engaged head of department, and that was strongly associated with successful change. And another feature that was strongly associated with successful change was a sense of collective commitment across faculty. So faculty, rather than just seeing their own course and the delivery of their own modules or courses, they actually took a responsibility to a much greater extent for the curriculum as a whole, and had a collective commitment to designing and delivering a high-quality curriculum rather than just their portion of it. What was very interesting with these interviews is when you dig a little deeper as to, okay, so why are these changes happening? Where does this collective commitment come from? That invariably, and in 90% of the cases that I've looked at, that collective commitment came from a crisis. It came from a significant problem with recruitment, retention, employability, that led to this sense of collective commitment. We have to do something together. And this led me to think, okay, so this is changes that have been implemented over the last 20 years, many of which were triggered by a crisis. But must change also always be triggered by a crisis? How can we create conditions? How can we engineer a situation where we know that the conditions are ripe for change, and we can create that ourselves without artificially creating a crisis? And I would say there are two challenges here. Two key challenges to creating conditions for change, and I just wanted to briefly talk about those two. The first is creating an impetus for a unified vision of change across all levels of the university hierarchy, getting that engagement from department heads, from senior university managers, from deans. And one of the things, as John mentioned, that I've been very interested in looking at over the last 5 years is an increasing engagement by governments in engineering education, seeing engineering education as an incubator of technology-driven entrepreneurship and ultimately economic growth, and therefore strategically investing in engineering education. And so, as John mentioned, one example that I've been quite involved with is in Chile. The Ministry of Finance, not the Ministry of Education, but the Ministry of Finance in Chile has invested $60 million recently in engineering schools as a driver for economic growth in Chile. And a large portion of that is focused on educational change. And I'm now working on a study looking at the influence of this kind of intervention on attitudes of faculty and capacity and practice in educational change in engineering. And I'm halfway through that study, but it really seems as if this intervention has had a very profound effect, particularly on attitudes among senior managers to the potential impact of educational change. And the second challenge that I see, or of the key challenges to creating the conditions for positive change in engineering education, is, without a crisis, establishing widespread faculty engagement. And with a lot of the work that I've done and the surveys and interviews of faculty, it's clear that promotion systems, recognition and reward systems are a major deterrent for faculty to engage with educational change. That by and large, reward and recognition systems are seen to be driven by achievement in research rather than achievement in education. And there's a lot of evidence that is actually the case. This is, very briefly, this is a model for how teaching achievement is recognised and rewarded at most universities across the world. That there is often a threshold of acceptable teaching, and below that threshold, in many cases, a person may be denied promotion on the basis of their poor teaching. There's often a threshold for leadership in teaching and learning, and in a small number of cases, perhaps an individual on an education-focused contract may be promoted on the basis of teaching and learning. But actually, those cases are maybe a handful of cases in each situation a year. But for the vast majority of faculty, any incremental increase in their achievement in teaching and learning beyond this minimum threshold very often isn't recognised and rewarded in promotion systems. And this is a significant issue, I think, for engaging faculty with educational change. So very briefly, a project that I'm currently working on with the Royal Academy of Engineering is to create something we're provisionally calling the Career Framework for University Teaching, to actually set up a framework. Because one of the things that we've found is that there's a real willingness to change. There's a willingness to improve how teaching is recognised and rewarded at universities. But one of the big barriers is actually, how do you measure teaching? How do you evaluate it? How do you evidence it? And this is what we've been working on, is creating this framework that has 3 elements to it. An element of what are the general principles underpinning progression on the basis of teaching and learning. What are the criteria for each of those levels? And what evidence do faculty need to put on the table to demonstrate that they've actually achieved the criteria? I won't go through this in any detail, but there are 4 levels of achievement that we've defined. One on the basis of impact in student learning, one on impact in educational knowledge, pedagogical scholarship, and one on impact on the institution. So this is defining levels of achievement by which you can reward and recognise teaching. And then within that, then looking at the evidence domains. How do you actually demonstrate achievement? So that you can put it in a promotion case, it can be evaluated, and it can be recognised and rewarded. And we're working with, at the moment, with 14 university partners from around the world, and I think a number of them, I think at least 4 actually are represented here today, to evaluate the template and to, in many cases, to pilot it and to use it to redesign promotion systems. All of the information is available on the web. A provisional template has been published. It's also on our website, which is evaluatingteaching.com. So that all the information is there if anyone's interested. We're now going through this evaluation process and plan to publish the finalised framework in about 6 months' time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth.